Good morning, Brew Daily Show. I'm Neal Fryman.
And I'm Toby Howell.
Today, Congress thought it had a deal to avoid a government shutdown this Saturday. Then Elon Musk entered the chat.
Then the Fed issued its final rate cut of the year. So why did your stock portfolio tank? It's Thursday, December 19th. Let's ride. Good news, Neal. You can finally plan that trip to Washington State you've been putting off. That's because officials announced yesterday that the so-called giant murder hornets have been successfully eradicated from the state following a years-long effort to find and eliminate the non-native pest. Murder hornets were first sighted in the area all the way back in 2019, but state officials quickly mobilized to try and contain their presence due to the threat the giant insects pose to their honeybee and other pollinators. Consider that threat contained, too. No hornet has been sighted in the last 3 years. Thank goodness, Neal.
Giant murder hornet is probably the most appropriate name ever given to an animal. These things can be 2 inches long. Just think about a hornet that's 2 inches long in your head right now. They can wipe out an entire honeybee hive in less than 90 minutes by decapitating the bees there and then defending the hive as their own, all while using the brood to feed their baby hornets. They can also sting through beekeeper suits, deliver almost 7 times the amount of venom as a honeybee, and sting multiple times. That's why an entomologist in the Washington State Department of Agriculture said, "I've been doing this for over 25 years now. It is a rare day when the humans actually get to win one against the insects."
I'm not going to lie. I remember the peak of murder hornet panic back in, 2019, 2020. We were all in lockdown and we're like, now the murder hornets are coming for us as well. So thank goodness. They said the public played a huge role as well, taking pictures and reporting sightings, because of course the public played a role. If I saw a 2-inch murder hornet, I would say something as well. So congrats to Washington State. Plan your vacay there. Now, a word from our sponsor, the Range Rover Sport. Neal, pardon the pun so early in the morning, but one of the best things about the Range Rover Sport is its range. It's the kind of car you can roll up to a black tie gala in, then take it to the mountains for a hike the next day.
It's the mullet of cars, business in the front and party in the back, but also party in the front because this baby purse.
And the Venn diagram where one circle reads sophisticated luxury and the other reads pure power, guess what's sitting right in the middle?
Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
No, although he is a classy and powerful guy. It's the Range Rover Sport. It truly brings a new dimension to sporting luxury.
Build your Range Rover Sport today at LandRoverUSA.com. That's LandRoverUSA.com.
To no one's surprise, the Fed announced its third and final rate cut of 2024 yesterday, reducing the benchmark rate by 25 basis points down to a range of 4.25 to 4.5%. So why did all 3 major indexes finish deep in the red? While the rate cut itself was all but guaranteed, it was the Fed's cautious outlook for 2025 that had investors a little spooked. The Fed is now projecting only 2 cuts next year, as opposed to the 4 that were anticipated back in September. The Fed also revised their forecast for inflation to 2.5%, up from the 2.1% it originally projected. In Jerome Powell's press conference after the announcement, he tried to frame fewer rate cuts as a vote of confidence in the economy, but he also said that the cuts announced at this meeting were a closer call than expected due to just how sticky inflation has been. So, Neal, as we close out 2024 with a pretty strong economy, slowly fading inflation, and a stable job market, the question becomes what comes next?
And Powell said 2 rate cuts next year. That was not welcomed by investors. The Dow had its 10th straight day in the red. The S&P had its worst day since August. Yields jumped, which shows that borrowing costs are rising. The mortgage rate jumped above 7% for the first time. This was a very violent reaction. I think investors who had believed Powell knew what he was doing for the past couple of years, saw a little uncertainty in what Powell was projecting for the future. And I think an even bigger question was, why do we have the rate cut now? A lot of the press conference, Powell spent talking about how inflation was sticky and he's worried about inflation. Well, the last thing you want to do when you're worried about inflation is cut rates, which is what he did. So I think those 2 factors, fewer rate cuts next year, and then failure to explain why they cut rates this time, led to an extremely violent market reaction.
Right. A lot of the reporters there asked some variations of that same question, is if inflation is proving to be stickier and you're projecting it to be stickier, then why did you even cut rates on this meeting whatsoever? And it wasn't guaranteed, even though, remember, the market was pricing a 99% chance or a 90+% chance that the Fed would cut rates this meeting. There was actually a dissenting vote of the Fed officials that do vote on these rate cuts. So it was a lively discussion, I think, at that table of like, should we cut rates this time around? Powell's response was, in effect, that future rate cuts aren't guaranteed. So like, let's do it while the economy is still strong and inflation isn't too high. So rather like a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush type approach. But you're right, the market definitely did not like that, especially because, the projections got so much darker, essentially. We were looking at 4 rate cuts. Now it's down to 2, and that could shift even lower if this inflation proves to be as sticky as, Powell is saying it is.
Yeah. I think the general interpretation of what Powell was saying was that this was a pause, not a skip. So the next Fed meeting is in January. If Powell signaled that they would just skip a rate cut then and then continuing the rate cuts going forward, I don't think the market would have reacted like it did. But this was a signal that they're kind of pausing this for now. And one thing I also want to talk about is that, Powell was asked about Trump's policies and how that would impact inflation and rate cuts. And, economists do widely view Trump's policies of tax cuts, mass deportations, tariffs as being inflationary. So, Powell was going to get pelted with questions about how that would shape the inflation and rate cut outlook. He demurred. He said that, it's too early to tell. It's very premature to try to make any kind of conclusion. Powell and Trump were both in the same positions in 2018 and 2019 when Trump enacted a bunch of tariffs on China. Powell said we can't really learn that many lessons from those tariffs about what might happen in 2025 if there are more tariffs. So we are entering a state of uncertainty that we haven't seen in a few years. Powell compared it to driving on a foggy night or walking in a dark room full of furniture. You just slow down. So the word, I think, is caution.
Congressional leaders released the text of a 3-month spending bill on Tuesday that was supposed to prevent a government shutdown, but the stopgap spending bill has a lot of people big mad. Inside the over 1,500-page bill were a few head-scratching inclusions. There's $100 billion earmarked for disaster relief in the wake of a devastating hurricane season, economic aid for farmers, and a commitment to fully fund a rebuild of Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge. But there's also a cost of living pay increase for members of Congress, reforms for pharmacy benefit managers, and a measure that clears the way for the Washington Commanders football stadium to be moved from Landover, Maryland, back to D.C. Two of the most vocal opponents of the bill were none other than Elon Musk and his Doge co-head Vivek Ramaswamy. The two wasted no time in flexing their budding political power, railing against this stopgap bill. Elon alone posted on X about the funding bill more than 100 times over the course of the last 2 days, and it worked. House Majority Leader Steve Scalise told reporters that the current iteration of the bill is now dead, while Trump himself voiced his opposition to it as well. This was supposed to be a pretty uncontroversial bill so Congress could regroup and figure out what their priorities were in the new year, but it's proven to be just the opposite.
This is what they call an end-of-year Christmas tree bill, which is where all the lawmakers see this bill that needs to get passed to avoid a government shutdown, which will happen if they don't pass this at 12:01 a.m. Eastern on Saturday. And they just start decorating it with their own pet projects. You see something like the RFK Stadium getting moved to D.C. so that the Commanders could get back to the district and these other small pet projects. And, it wasn't loved by a lot of right-wing conservatives when it was released, but it seemed like it could potentially pass with help from Democrats. And then all of a sudden, I wake up yesterday morning, I see Elon Musk's Twitter feed going absolutely off. She's showing himself to be an absolute force, even though he's not an elected representative. He has no official position in government, but he is using his bully pulpit on X to move the needle. And then later in the day, President-elect Trump came out and said, this bill is a disaster, and it looks like they will have to go back to the drawing board, even though we are less than 36 hours away from a government shutdown.
Right. It put Musk out a little bit on a limb in the early days or the early time when he was tweeting, because despite some of that opposition from congressional Republicans, no one had really come out because, again, it is one of those end-of-year bills. It is just a tide over to keep the government running for the next 3 months. But Musk said, absolutely no. He weighed in and said, like, this bill shall not pass. He loved that meme. He posted that multiple times. He literally posted over 100 times about this, really flexing his weight. Some people started to say, though, that this is a interesting strategy from Elon because right now he's spending some political capital, getting in on a day-to-day skirmish. Like, this is not, in the grand scheme of things, the biggest thing that Congress is going to be facing over the next 4 years. But here he was tweeting 100 times about it, even before Trump gets into office. So is he spending that political capital too early and too frequently? That was some of the kind of analysis of this, even though technically his bullying the Congress is working in this particular instance.
So what would a shutdown mean if it were to happen? For people who are, I guess, 5 years old, you have lived through a government shutdown before. From December 2018 to January 2019, essentially all non-essential federal employees stop working. So at that time, 350,000 were furloughed. But then you have the essential federal employees like TSA and air traffic controllers who still will work but without pay, and then they get back pay. At that previous government shutdown, 420,000 federal employees were working without pay. So we have this big, busy holiday travel season coming up, and you're probably going to encounter TSA agents and air traffic controllers who are not being paid. So that is a very interesting conundrum. So we have until tomorrow to get this bill passed, and we'll see if they go back, streamline it, and take out all of the pork that had been criticized and pass a new one. But certainly Elon has thrown Congress a curveball, and it's certainly a sign of things to come. Less flexibility for employees means lower headcount. That's the conclusion of new research from Revelio Labs, which found that companies requiring return to office grow their workforces more slowly than companies that allow hybrid work. Since June 2022, companies with hybrid work policies have increased their headcount by 1.6%. For businesses mandating that employees commute to the office, that growth rate is 1%. Now, this could be intentional. Remember, workers have long suspected that return to office mandates were a sneaky way for companies to lay off employees without laying off employees. And one executive seemed to confirm as much after Amazon announced a 5-day in-office requirement starting in January. The AWS CEO said if employees don't want to comply, that's okay. There are other companies around. But hiring fewer people means you're also hiring fewer all-star people. A separate study from the University of Pittsburgh noted brain drain as a significant cost of RTO mandates. The research found companies requiring in-office work took significantly longer to fill job openings and suffered abnormally high turnover, which is consistent with the other study showing slower growth. Toby, do you think corporate bosses are going to look at this and think, maybe we should be more flexible? Seems like the downsides of an in-person requirement outweigh the advantages.
Potentially, but like you said, a lot of these companies that did implement RTO policies were hoping that they would see some turnover. That was kind of the hidden thing that a lot of these companies were going for. They wanted to trim down their workforce without actually conducting layoffs. Where I do think you will see some of these companies taking pause, though, is that if your skilled employees and if your more senior employees are more likely to leave, that is something that you do not want. You mentioned brain drain, but yeah, some of these high position or higher, pay grade positions are more difficult to fill, and you do not want that to experience a lot of turnover. So I do think you potentially will see some pause, which we've already started to see some companies kind of rethink some of their RTO plans because they haven't gone as smoothly as they expected.
Well, I think you're talking about Amazon. So Amazon, the announcement that they were going to go 5 days a week beginning in January kind of shocked the AHR world. They are the biggest company that ever in the world that would require 5 days to work in office, and it spurred a cascade of other companies like Dell and AT&T to announce return to office requirements. But reports in the past few days showed that Amazon has told certain employees, it could be in the thousands in certain cities like Dallas and New York, that their offices are not ready to get people back 5 days a week. They just don't have enough office space. They didn't prepare. So they told them that they would have to come back into the office, but not until April or May. So there have been a lot of logistical challenges. It's one thing to say, yeah, we want you back in the office. It's another thing to, get the office ready and have the Keurig pods all ready and make sure there's enough desks so people aren't huddled all over each other. So Amazon's return to office drama just took another swerve.
The last swerve of this study that I want to speak about is not just the quantitative effect of our RTO policy, but also the qualitative effect. A lot of employees cited why they hated RTO. One of it was just the drama that follows it. The Amazon, so much drama followed this announcement, and a lot of employees just want to work. They do not want to be constantly mired in this debate. So that was one thing. And then another thing they talked about is that when you institute RTO, you're communicating a culture of distrust, saying that you're tracking our badge sign-ins, like you are making sure we're coming in. Dell was doing VPN tracking to see if people were trying to pretend they were working from one location when they weren't. So it's not just the quantitative factors and effects. It is also just the qualitative employee morale effects that you have to take into account. Speaking of taking into account, there's one more left in the year. It's the last Neal's Numbers coming your way.
Welcome to Neal's Numbers, the segment where I share 3 stats from the week's news that will make you feel like you just finished a really good book. My first number will have you thinking twice about using your GPS. A new study released in the British Medical Journal found that taxi drivers die at lower rates from Alzheimer's than people in other professions, which maybe suggests that using your brain to navigate the world could ward off the disease. After examining 9 million adult death certificates, researchers found that around 3.9% of everyone in the dataset died of Alzheimer's, but for taxi drivers, the rate was just 1%. That is not to say that driving a taxi is healthy. In general, they had lower life expectancies compared to the average. But as far as Alzheimer's is concerned, it got the scientists thinking that creating spatial maps in your mind all day could mean a bigger hippocampus, which is the part of the brain responsible for learning, memory, and navigating.
These implications are actually really big because what it's implying is that there are things you can do during your lifetime that could potentially reduce your risk for dying of Alzheimer's, which is something that, of course, researchers want to dig into. Some other interesting things from this finding, too, is that people who had jobs that involved navigating to a predetermined route, think bus drivers, airplane pilots, ship captains, they did not have a lower rate of Alzheimer's. So there is something about the fact that you do have to spatially reckon, you do have to memorize these routes that did contribute to lower Alzheimer's rate. So that was just a fascinating thing, that it's not just using navigational abilities, it is the fact that you cannot be riding a predetermined route.
Now, some critics of the study, and there were many, noted some limitations. First of all, the age of death of taxi and ambulance drivers. Ambulance drivers were the number 2 lowest risk after taxi drivers, was around 64 to 67 years of age. And Alzheimer's doesn't really set in until 65, so they noted that criticism. And then there's the potential that there's a self-selection going on, the fact that, hey, people who have bigger hippocampi just naturally gravitate to being a taxi driver. So the causation correlation effect doesn't really work, because maybe it's not the fact that I'm driving a taxi gives my brain a workout. It's that I really like navigating and going through cities. That's why I'm gravitating to be a taxi driver. So those are just 2 of the limitations pointed out. This is not a definitive study, but it certainly raises really interesting questions about how creating spatial maps in your mind can, give your brain a good workout. For my next number, America's youth are more straight edge than they've been in decades. An annual national survey of teens showed that substance use is hitting new lows, while abstaining from drugs is hitting new highs. For example, about 2/3 of 12th graders said they hadn't used alcohol, marijuana, cigarettes, or e-cigarettes in the last 30 days, the largest share since measuring began in 2017. These findings have shocked public health officials in the best way. Drug and alcohol use among teens fell the most in history during the pandemic, when kids were at home with their parents instead of playing beer pong with their friends. But researchers fully expected the toking and drinking to pick back up when COVID was over. That hasn't happened. Instead of rebounding, drug use has continued to fall years after stay-at-home rules were lifted.
Yeah, I think it's because a lot of teens who do end up experimenting with drugs or alcohol, they usually start in the 9th grade, your first year of high school, because you see a lot of your older peers doing it. But if you break that cycle and the incoming 9th graders never saw anyone drinking or smoking, never experimented with their friends, then as you filter through upwards through the generations, every class after that class, the COVID class, is not going to have that experience either. So it is almost a self-fulfilling cycle where you start to see lower and lower usage rates. So I think that was interesting because a lot of people's experimentation doesn't happen in your own room under the supervision of your parents. It happens when you're surrounded by friends, when there's peer pressure involved. So it is a really fascinating, downstream effect of those COVID lockdown periods.
For my final number, a question for everyone planning your wedding. Would you pick a date to avoid a conflict with a football game? For lovebirds in college football hotspots, the answer seems to be yes. The Washington Post dove into data from The Knot to find that for the majority of areas with powerhouse college football programs, Saturdays where the local team isn't playing are more popular wedding dates than game day Saturdays. Here's some actual numbers. In and around Auburn, Alabama, 3.8% of the year's weddings took place on each of the team's idle fall Saturdays since 2022. That's compared to home game Saturdays, excluding Thanksgiving weekend, when an average of 2.1% of the year's weddings were held. Let's look at one specific date too, October 22nd, 2022. Toby, you remember this date?
No.
All right, so the Auburn Tigers had a bye week. In that market, in the Auburn market, 5.3% of the year's weddings took place that day, compared to 3.1% nationally. The Washington Post interviewed wedding planners in the Southeast to see if this data was backed up by their own experiences, and they said absolutely. People do try to plan their weddings for days when the team isn't playing, and this makes a lot of sense to me. There's nothing worse than having to split your attention between the fourth quarter on your phone and the beautiful couple exchanging their vows.
I get that too, because I've been at weddings where people are watching college football games, and it is a little bit of annoying, but also just the logistics side of it I think is under talked about, because college football weekends are a zoo in these towns. So like traffic's a nightmare. Hotel rooms are hard to come by. They're very expensive as well. So I totally understand from that perspective. They also talked to some couples though that just gave up and said, hey, if there's going to be a game on, let's embrace it. One couple created a game lounge at the reception venue where people could go watch the game. If it is such a big part of your family that people would not be paying attention to your wedding, might as well set up a screen and have everyone watch it together. I mean,
we're sports fans, but that's pretty hardcore.
That is pretty hardcore. I cannot relate to it because we don't have, I'm an Indiana fan now this year, but I never had that, crazy love for college football. So, shout out to all the Southern couples out there. I know it's bigger. It just means more down there.
Let's sprint to the finish with some final headlines. TikTok will fight for its life at the Supreme Court, which said yesterday it will hear arguments on a law that would ban the app on January 10th, 9 days before it goes into effect. TikTok is arguing that the law, which compels its owner ByteDance to sell it or else face a ban in the U.S., violates the First Amendment. Congress passed the measure earlier this year, citing national security concerns posed by this immensely popular Chinese-owned app. But for TikTok, there is hope. The Supreme Court agreed to hear this case.
Yeah, just the fact that the Supreme Court is setting aside time for oral arguments shows that the justices do see at least some critical questions about the First Amendment here. I know we've talked a lot about this TikTok saga, but this is probably the time where we are going to finally get a decision one way or the other. So if you've been kind of tuning out, this is the time to, tune back in.
I want your prediction. Ban or no ban?
I think...
What, is the Supreme Court going to stay it or let it go?
See, it's hard. I don't know what the Supreme Court will actually argue on the grounds of First Amendment, but I think overall, eventually, the app will not be banned just because there's so many logistical issues to it. So I'm going to say no ban.
That Toby says, let it ride. The first severe bird flu case was reported in the U.S. The CDC said that a patient in Louisiana has been hospitalized with bird flu, which is the first confirmed severe case of the H5N1 illness in the U.S. More than 60 mild human cases of bird flu have been reported this year, following an outbreak that has killed 123 million poultry since 2022 and infected more than 860 dairy herds. As for the severe case, the person had been in contact with birds, both sick and dead, in backyard flocks, the CDC said. Health officials stress the risk to the human population remains low, but many critics say the U.S. response has not been sufficient.
It's not been sufficient, but also there is not just this one case in Louisiana that people are worried about. Also in California, Gavin Newsom declared a state of emergency over the outbreak of bird flu, specifically related to the state's dairy cattle. They've discovered the virus in 645 herds of dairy cattle. That's more than any other in the state. They are saying the same thing. Risk to the public remains low, but there's definitely some threats to these cattle herds. It originally started in Texas, but now California has become kind of the epicenter of this bird flu cattle epidemic. Yesterday, OpenAI unveiled a new feature that lets you call ChatGPT directly from the phone number 1-800-ChatGPT. It's part marketing stunt and part useful feature addition. If your hands are full in the kitchen and you really want a classic delicious lasagna recipe, but your mom isn't picking up, dial up ChatGPT and ask it for an answer. But don't chat for too long. Callers will get 15 minutes of free chats per month. Neal, is this a good idea?
It's not a new idea, that's what I'll say. Back in 2007, Google launched a phone hotline called Goog 411, which offered free directory assistance by voice. They shut it down 3 years later without an official explanation. And Google VP Marissa Mayer, who was later the CEO of Yahoo, basically acknowledged this was the case. So even as far back as 2007, there was controversies around training data.
I think it is so funny, too, that every technological advancement we've had this year is something that Google tried 10, 15 years ago. I mean, think about Google Glass. Yeah. They were early to that. Now we're seeing all this range about Meta Ray-Bans. Obviously, all the artificial intelligence stuff, they were very early to as well. So it truly does say, like, sometimes just timing the market is as important as actually the features that you are releasing.
Let's wrap it up there. Thanks so much for spending your morning with us, and have a wonderful Thursday. For any questions, comments, or feedback, send an email to morningbrew@morningbrew.com. And if you're enjoying the show, please share it with a friend, family member, or coworker who needs a 25-minute news blast in the morning. For a more specific sharing idea, here's Toby.
I want you to share it with the college football fans in your life. This is going to be a very stressful weekend for a lot of you. I hope none of you are getting married either, but send them this pod. Send them a little bit of Neal and Toby. Hopefully we can calm their nerves.
Let's roll the credits. Emily Milliron is our executive producer. Raymond Liu is our producer. Olivia Graham is our associate producer. Uchenna Ogu is our technical director. Billy Menino is on audio. Call 1-800-HAIR and Makeup for a free wardrobe consultation. Devin Emery is our chief content officer, and our show is a production of Morning Brew.
Great show today, Neal. Let's run it back tomorrow.